Hello, and welcome back to the Reformed Rogue. We are picking up where we last left off with the Climax of Civilization in Chapter 2, The Course of Civilization. In its most general outline, the course of civilization through a cycle is not difficult to trace. Civilization advances by the striving and by the strife of individuals and combinations of men, both within a state and between different states, tribes, cities, or countries, and leads up to success in the attainment by some of a high position of wealth and enlightenment. The greater the height to which the attainment has proceeded, the more difficult does it become to keep what is attained and to carry the process further, and for the latter object, the inducement wanes. Then comes a time when the motive and deterrent forces approach equality, whereupon, strife and striving being no more desired by the leaders, there sets in a period of peace and enjoyment. This, through excessive leisure and dissipation, brings on degeneration of the leaders, giving opportunity to those who were left behind to seek to pull them down, introducing a new kind of contention, in which the lower peoples or orders, now the least bad elements, are the aggressors, and which must bring about disintegration, until out of the turmoil the best elements again obtain the leadership. Thus, in the ascending period, in spite of much destruction, production and acquisition exceed consumption. In the level period at the top, production and consumption for a time balance. In the descending period, even though there be less destruction than in the first, consumption outruns production. And, lastly, on the level at the bottom, consumption has to adapt itself to production from the lack of stores to draw upon. More in particular, the subject may be examined from the points of view, respectively, of 1. The military art, 2. Economics, 3. Population, 4. Morality, 5. The fine arts, literature, science, jurisprudence, thought in general, 6. Religion, and 7. Government. 1. The military art is at the beginning so inconsiderable that most bodies of men belonging to the same race, and therefore likely to be equal in physical strength, are on a par with one another. The very first development was the adoption of weapons of attack, which must have given the most intelligent an immense advantage over the rest. But with the extermination of the unarmed, the use of arms became fairly general, though with great unevenness of efficiency. Then defense behind stockades and other ramparts, especially stone walls, and on islands and hilltops, would quickly follow, and the defense would become stronger than the attack. Here is where we find all early civilizations at the beginning of their history. Means of communication being bad, as we have seen, communities would at first be small and numerous. The improvement of communication permits consolidation in large states, but what actively affects this is improvement in the means of attack over the defense. Such improvement came with the employment of horses and chariots, and the development of metallurgy, in places where mines were discovered and worked, or the metal could be obtained by commerce, and those peoples who were most favored in this way, or who, having a sufficiency of arms, organized and disciplined themselves most effectively, could conquer and subdue the others, for enslavement, with disarmament, now took place of extermination. The upward movement, therefore, is marked by a consolidation into large states in which the members of the superior race have the hegemony. At last, a period is reached when either one single state has absorbed all that it can reach, or a few states have become powerful on such an immense and nearly equal scale that they dread the losses of war, which may be greater than the gain, especially if there be 3 or more such, and the other or others, after 2 have fought each other out, may step in and seize the prize, in which condition also 2 or more of the weakest may combine against the strongest, preventing it from attacking them because of their combined superiority, and themselves fearing to conquer it because of the likelihood of succeeding dissension amongst themselves over the spoils. In either case, there comes a period of long peace, liable, however, to be broken at any moment through the foolishness which much prosperity engenders in some of the parties. The improvement in weapons of attack had another effect within the states. It enabled the first acquirers of such arms, and in all early civilizations, arms of metal, both offensive and defensive, were not abundant enough to go around, to subdue the rest of the community, and to tyrannize over them. The few who owned these instruments of power and kept them to themselves and their adherents, perhaps a conquering race, would rule the rest. They would seize the land, and their engrossment of the land would in its turn ensure them the monopoly of arms. But when iron became more abundant, and the extension of its use permitted a wider possession of arms, and the weapons of attack were improved sufficiently to break through the armor of personal defense, whereupon infantry had become more powerful than cavalry, then the lower classes would rise nearer to a par with their rulers, and, seeing how indispensable are their services in war, would demand a share in the government, and would enforce their demand by actually possessing force enough to make it safer for the occupants to admit them than to continue to exclude them. The period of peace would be reached only after this approximate equality of power had clearly exhibited itself, and a fair balance of the forces of the different classes were established. Also, about as this period is reached, before or shortly after, a change is effected in the composition of the army. At first, in all military states, the army is composed of a trained militia of all the free citizens. Afterwards, these are replaced by soldiers, whose characteristic is that they receive a sould, or pay, and become a profession. But when the competition of nearly equally large states is threatening, as in modern Europe, the professional army system is too weak, and the enforced militia system, or conscription, may be maintained even during the period of peace. Militarism has become an art, and, like the other arts, employs machinery, in the form of ballistic engines or artillery, a large supply of which must be kept up during peace to ensure safety from sudden attack, and the larger this supply needs to be, the quicker the attack can be delivered. This long period of peace, to repeat, broken only by a few quick wars, is a period of enjoyment and of lavish consumption. Luxury enters even the army, and the soldiers become discontented and refuse to fight unless they be well paid and well provisioned. In time, the natives become so degenerate that outsiders, mercenaries, have to be hired. All through this period, power is in the hands of those who have the ready money to pay the men. No longer the landowners, but the financiers are the directing class. The time comes when supplies, not only of delicacies, but of such necessities as metals needed for arms, begin to give out. At last, not even mercenaries can be obtained, or they, not being regularly paid, behave worse than enemies. The degenerate upper classes are then thrown back on their own resources. Great distances having to be covered, and men being too feeble to make long marches on foot, cavalry again comes into use. Artillery failing, the defense behind stone walls, masons now vying with smiths in popular favor, again becomes not only equal but superior to the attack, and decentralization sets in. For now, those who before were the weaker have become the stronger, and parts of great states which up till now were held together either through fear from without if they were to stand by themselves, or through internal coercion at the hands of those whose interest lay in collecting the widest contributions, fall apart through mutual repulsion and jealousy. Also, less favored outsiders, barbarians, whose armies are not encumbered with luxuries, and whose weapons by this time are equal, if not superior to those of the civilized, may overrun the territory of the latter, who find protection only in walled cities or in specially fortifiable spots where the defense can make itself strongest. These become detached and self-dependent and lose the incentive as well as the compulsion of holding or of being bound together. In the general debacle, there sounds a cry like that in Shipwreck, Sauve-qui-peut. The small sections into which the large states split sink back into a condition of petty and miscellaneous strife and warfare. 2. As regards economics in the early period, land is generally held to some extent in common by the communities. Forests and pastures are so held longest. Fields for plowing, sowing, and reaping are allotted annually, with the tendency to become settled in families. First to be appropriated are the plots on which the habitations are built, and then the hoed vegetable patches around them, then the fields, later the meadows, and lastly the forests. Wealth at first consists in what the land immediately produces or nourishes, and at last within the land itself. People carry on their industries in families or small circles. They are making most of the articles that satisfy their simple wants, and exchanges of small articles are mostly by barter, at fairs more or less periodic, for money is unknown or scarce. In important matters, such as the purchase of land, there is great formality, rendered necessary for impressing the affair upon the memory of witnesses in an age of illiteracy, and because, moreover, such transactions are discouraged, for the land was rarely parted with by its common or private owners, but was kept for ages in communities or families. Advances made by the introduction of money, and the greater employment of writing, more frequent and regular markets, the facilitation of contractual engagements, the breaking down of formalism, the acceleration of business dealings. The early period is one of custom, everything running in long continued grooves, individuals finding their places fixed for them, from which they can change without becoming outcasts only by entering into new family relations. It has been described as a period of status. Before the period of quiescence at the top is reached, the extension of the use of writing and money has changed it into a period of contracts, which continues on through the next stage of the cycle. Now, wealth is mobile, circulation rapid, and everything being exchangeable for money, all values are measurable in the common denominator of price. In the early period, because of the scarcity of money, there could be no taxation in kind, and therefore it fell directly upon the landowners. Men who were allowed to have land of their own, like their ancestors who had to fight for it, were required to give in return for it service and defense of the country. The armies were raised from the tillers of the soil, who had to equip themselves and also to supply their provisions until they could win their sustenance in the enemy's country. But as money became abundant, wealth was produced by the further elaboration of materials in a multiplicity of industries. Taxation was changed from collection in kind to collection in money, and then was levied also on the industrialists. The landed men, who still had the power, said that as they did the fighting, the others should pay for it, and so taxes came to be shifted more and more from land to industry, till finally the soldiers were entirely paid, while the landowners retained their land without the requirement of service, and with only a small share of the taxes. Men enriched by industry likewise sought to become landowners, and finally land itself becomes easily exchangeable, and often changes hands and passes out of communities, the common land being grabbed in large tracts or purchased at low rates, and out of families, becoming the property of individuals to do with what they please, like any commodity or object of consumption, and bequeathable at will, as is by this time all property. The principal wealth now, however, consists of many other exchangeable things besides land, though all their though all have their root in the land. Formerly, wealth consisted chiefly in materials little worked over from the state in which they were derived from the soil. As time advances, more and more attention is paid to the elaboration of materials into finer and finer articles of art and luxury, more also to actions that please, such as exhibitions of agility and of mentality, and less to the providing of materials, which labor sinks in estimation and is relegated to slaves or the most mean-spirited freemen, so that the superstructure grows while the base diminishes. Before, power gave wealth and distinction. Now wealth gives power, and there is little distinction except according to one's possessions. Before, the relations between the classes were determined by custom, and consisted mostly in services. Now all relations between free persons, except that between husband and wife, and this too tends to become so, are contracted for in monetary payments, as, for instance, the one already noticed between the government and the soldiers. Money therefore reigns as the prime mover, and the one general object of desire. In the ascending period, money, growing in abundance from either increased production of the precious metals, or the employment of credit substitutes, or both, prices rise, and this favors the producers of commodities who get continually greater returns on their original outlay of borrowed capital. Later, the mines giving out, or the class of those who have capital to lend, getting into power and corralling money supply, prices, through many fluctuations, often purposely manipulated, gradually fall, and the causes of the fall are carefully nursed, whereby the possessors of loanable capital benefit at the expense of the producers. The corporation system, originally employed for religious, sociable, or eleemosynary purposes, is now put to service not only by industrialists, but by financiers, and by large combinations of the last, monopolies are formed, which, turned over to business managers, crush out smaller rivals by unfair competition and strive to stem the fall of prices, even to raise them by purposely curtailing production. Such consolidation of capital goes on after the consolidation of the state has come to a stand. Now, either the state or corporations manage everything, and individual initiative sinks to a minimum. The persons who make their fortune in this easy way try to solidify it by safe investments, with which ultimately center in land, so that a concentration of land ownership goes on. The newly rich, whose number necessarily is small, purchasing large tracts from the many long-time owners of small portions who are ruined through an inability to compete with large-scale production. Yet large-scale production, when left in command of the field, always tends to lessen production for the purpose of keeping up prices. The lessening of production is carried further also by the action of the workmen, who likewise, on their side, combine, refuse to work as hard as before, deteriorate. Slave laborers, being habitually overworked, always tend to give out, and their numbers were renewed during the early period of warfare by the subjugation of weaker peoples. But this source is now exhausted, and the supply is barely renewed for a time by slave raids on inferior outside races until such races grow strong, or sentiment at home no longer tolerates such conduct. Or cheap free labor is sought from the civilizations which have already decayed, or from peoples still barbarous, and lower races are imported to do the hard and dirty work and to keep down wages. In the ascending period, when the time came for taxation, it was first laid upon the sources of wealth, especially upon the land, But in the succeeding periods, the most prominent objects for taxing are the great accumulations of wealth, and so we have the income tax and the legacy tax, of which the latter tends to dissipate capital, and the former permits sources to be held unproductive for speculation, especially land, which, while undeveloped, escapes almost scot-free. Everything thus makes for decreasing production, while nothing restrains consumption. This course receives still further encouragement. In the ascending period, at least in the beginning, it was by his own strength and influence that the individual possessor, the head of a family, aided by his sons and dependents, had to defend his property. Therefore, too, a man's property, at least his landed estate, could not safely be divided, and so, where the people were wise, either it went to only one of his children, preferably the eldest son, as the one of greatest development and experience, or, a much less wise expedient, he kept down the number of his legitimate offspring. But already toward the end of the period, it becomes the government which, by enforcing all the contractual rights of individuals, protects property. In fact, this function of the state, wielded by the police, becomes one of the principal purposes of government in the culminating period. Now, therefore, a man's real estate, as well as the rest of his property, may be divided with safety, and there arises a demand for its distribution among all his sons, and even among all his children, including his daughters, or at least a demand that he may be permitted so to distribute his property if he chooses, and he is likely to desire to do so, now that it can be done with impunity, because of a natural inclination to favor all his children alike. There takes place a change in the moral point of view, as will be examined presently. Estates then are divided and subdivided and frittered away, until this tendency is counteracted by a universal economy in children, as we shall see. Furthermore, in general, the distinction between weak men and strong men, and even between men and women, becomes obliterated. Weak individuals without family connections can now rise by their shrewdness to great wealth, and wealth, even land, may be owned, if given to them, by women as well as by men. Wealth, even land, is given to women, and owning it, women become powerful, like men. The distinction between the sexes tends to break down, for women, being made by men independent of men in particular, seems to be independent of men in general, and they come to make the mistake of thinking they are so, and hence are equal to men, to which they are helped by the fact that many weak men are in a similar position of sham independence. This breaking down of old relations goes on with little hindrance during the long period of peace. The upper classes of the wealthy may now be the weaklings of society, while the really strongest men are among the lower, and the abundance of leisure and the indulgence of luxuries of sight and taste and touch on the part of the upper classes tends to enhance this inverted condition. Hence, when the period of failing production sets in, the state being ruled by degenerates, disintegration hastens its pace, until at last the ignorant strong ones from the lower classes rise to the surface, where they quickly degenerate in their turn, and permit the process to be repeated, or from outside barbarians overthrow them, who may in time be the beginners of a new cycle. 3. The influences that affect population run in an equally discernible revolution. In the turbulence of an ancient civilization, a free woman can hardly support herself without an individual male protector, and such a one is sought for her by her father and brothers, while every free man needs a wife to save him from the petty labors of the household, which it is his task to provide for and defend. There is thus a division of labor between the sexes, and a natural dependence of each upon the other. They need each other also on their children's account, whom, too, they need, the father needing sons to aid him when they grow up, and the mother needing in her domestic industries the help and companionship, especially of daughters, while they are young. For in such a period there are few means of laying by a store of provisions for old age, wherefore poor people need children to support them when old and feeble, and those who possess the only form which capital can then take, land, need children to work it and guard it and to pass it on. Children thus being in that period useful members of the family, of little initial expense, and soon yielding a return, and ultimately an indispensable prop, are welcome, and especially so if their value is enhanced religiously by ancestor worship, which makes it a duty to have a successor, and also a further object of desire, since the father himself expects to be worshipped and to have his manes attended to after his death. Therefore, during this period, except for special reasons, also mostly of a religious nature, almost everyone, especially among the upper classes, is married, and families are fair-sized, while the lower classes, the proletariat, are prolific like animals. Many children are produced, furthermore, because in the dearth of other kinds of amusement, the chase and warfare between being the two principal ones, the pleasure of intercourse between the sexes holds a prominent place among the sources of happiness, so much so that more children are born than needed, and the defective and superfluous are allowed to perish. The result is that population tends to press upon the means of subsistence which the tribe or nation has at its command, which pressure increases the incentive to war upon one's neighbors. This warring has the effect not only of giving more room for expansion, if successful, and, if not, of reducing the excess of population, but in either case being conducted mostly in hand-to-hand combats, or by the hurling of missiles at short range, of killing off the weakest and least agile. Thus, during this period, there is overproduction of population, destruction of the unfit, and survival of the fittest, giving full play to natural selection between individuals within each community or race, and between communities or races. Moreover, the repressive action of outside peoples who resist and restrain the expansion of any one given people throws this one people back upon itself and compels it to seek improvement in its means of support. A new direction is given to effort, to the subduing of the earth, and by the distress occasioned by the failure of food from the increasing number of mouths, fanatic tribes are driven out of the forests to the domestication of animals on the plains, or to the pastoral state. The pastoral families are driven from the plains to the river valleys, and to agriculture, and lastly the agricultural clans are driven down their rivers or across plains and mountains to the seashore, to commerce and industrialism, and to the founding of cities and of states. The fittest among these latter continue to enlarge themselves, and the arts and sciences improving, there goes on continual increase of productiveness, permitting increase of population, and this proceeds well into the period of peace, at the commencement of which it advances with leaps and bounds. For improvement in the means of transport by enabling provisions to be brought from greater distances permits the enlargement of cities, which is stimulated by the attractive power of the great and cheaper amusements there to be found, many being supplied to the poor gratuitously, while the land in the neighborhood, being high-priced also for purposes of recreation, cannot, beyond the range of truck farming, compete productively with the cheaper land at a distance, and agriculture gives way to pasturage, and small farms to large estates. The cities suck up the labor of the country, and their sewage drains away the fertility of the soil. Taxes spent in the cities fall most heavily in comparison with resources on the rural districts, And while the cities grow in population and in splendor, the country is impoverished and depopulated, till at last the cities find themselves left high and dry, without support, on a soil saturated with filth, and then famine, pestilence, and the inroads of barbarians destroy them. But ere this, the pressure of population upon its limits has, on the whole, for various reasons, been diminishing. For when a high stage of civilization is reached, with security of person and property provided by the state and its paid agents, the courts and the police, women no longer have the same need of individual male protectors, and they may now provide for themselves by their own labors, many doing so for a time at least, some throughout life. But especially as we have seen, they may now, in their own right, own property, which they have either acquired by their own efforts, or, more commonly, which has been bequeathed or donated to them by their fathers and husbands. And therefore, unmarried, they may be as well off as married. Men also may now have their household accommodations and other wants supplied by servants, or may find them outside in inns and taverns, hotels and restaurants, not to omit mention of the ancient vaults or stews. Men, therefore, are likewise less dependent upon individual women. Their mutual dependence in great measure breaks down. Consequently, marriages are on both sides less desired and become less frequent. And when they are entered, their dissolution is less dreaded by both parties, and even is desired whenever to either the connection becomes at all irksome, wherefore divorces are common. Moreover, both men and women now have other capital besides land, and may provide for their old age themselves. Children are, by consequence, not needed as a future support. Instead, they become a drag, requiring a much longer education, and among the rich, often calling for support all through the lifetime of the parents. In fact, children become little more than an agrément of life, a luxury, so to speak, yet in rivalry with other luxuries from which they detract. There are many forms of pleasure which cast into the shade that There are many forms of pleasure which cast into the shade that derivable from legitimate intercourse in the connubial state. Scientific knowledge is also disseminated of the means of preventing issue, and even conception, permitting of sexual indulgence without the inconvenience of childbearing. The growth of luxury in city life also gives freer scope to promiscuity and prostitution, with dispersion of venereal diseases, and importation of them into the family, with the result on the one hand of rendering the wife sterile or incompetent to bear more than one child, and on the other of giving some women a fright about marriage. Soft living and want of hard work weakens the constitution, and not only makes people more sensitive to pain, but also less able and willing to undergo it. This is alleviated slightly by voluntary exercise in athletics, which, however, dissipates energy uselessly. Chasing after a ball, for instance, which is now done even by grown-up people. Among the many refinements, personal cleanliness becomes habitual and is often carried to excess. Frequent ablutions and rubbings wear off the epidermis and exposing to contagious diseases, while the sterilization of surroundings by giving little exercise to one's own prophylactic corpuscles lowers one's power of resistance. New diseases therefore come in spite of hygienic precautions. The consequent debilitation lessens the strength to bear the burden of a family. The result is there are fewer families than there used to be in a given number of population, and the families themselves are smaller. To this change, the old religion can offer little opposition, since it too has fallen into abeyance, and worship is but a spectacular formalism. Now wealth is the ideal, and because the fewer the children, the more each will inherit. At best, only one, or at most only two heirs are desired, who may die and leave none. This change takes place first in the upper classes, then in the middle, and finally extends down to the lower, reaching these when fraternal societies and state pensions for old age take away the last incentive for having children, and the prohibition of child labor makes children a burden. While it is only in the upper classes, or also in the middle, the discrepancy between the production of children in the upper and the lower classes has the effect of increasing their economic inequality. For it promotes the concentration of wealth in the few at the top by making them fewer, while it still permits the lower classes to become poorer through their increasing numbers. When this last effect ceases by the lower classes also learning restraint at the highest point of a civilization, there may become a balance between the production of children and the room for them, and soon afterward the production of children may even fall below the number requisite for keeping up the race. There is little natural selection now. On the contrary, there is an effort to make the unfit survive, the science of medicine and hygiene being employed for this special purpose. Indeed, natural selection is reversed, for the fit are exposed to hardships and to early death, or they shun the responsibility of giving birth, while the unfit are spared and indulge in irresponsible procreation. There is both decrease of quantity and deterioration of quality of the population, which goes on till the decay of the civilization lets in outsiders who have not been subject to these influences, and a new period of insecurity and turbulence brings back the former relation between the sexes and between parents and children. 4. Morality also has its course. At first it is instinctive, exercising a blind impulse for self-preservation and for race preservation, the natural need for food and for love. Love brings several persons into close relationship with one another, and thereby primitive man learns the benefit of communion, and from the immediate family he extends fellowship to those whose progenitors were similarly bound together, and who now live in the same neighborhood, and join in the chase, to the clan or gens, then to the tribe, and still later to the larger combinations of city and nation. Between these bodies, especially between the large cities and states, competition was so keen that each was exposed to great danger, and lived on perpetual guard like animals. Hence there was extreme need, which most men are intelligent enough to perceive, for all the individuals in them to herd together in the closest union, and every one demanded from every other more attention to the whole than to himself. So necessary and universal was this collectivism that it was taken for granted. Later, when the need for it begins to break down, and it has to be cultivated, it is called patriotism, though by now it covers rather the occupants of a territory rather than the descendants of a common father. When, further, one successful state has absorbed all the others within its reach, or adjoining states with natural boundaries have learnt the wisdom of peacefulness, then the teaching of patriotism sinks before that of cosmopolitanism, or of humanitarianism in general. Everyone is now allowed to pay more attention to his own interests, and allows everyone else to do the same. There comes on an age of individualism, with the motto of everyone for himself and the devil take the hindmost. To outsiders, conduct always was harsh, brutal at first, but tending to become gentler through mutual regulation when the advantages derivable from keeping engagements were recognized. but the principal means of advance in this line has come through the taking in of more and more outsiders into the circle of neighborliness, until at last this becomes almost all comprehensive. The establishment of contractual relations introduces a change in morality, which begins in the culminating period, but becomes most prominent in the declining. In the early period, the principal injunction was of loyalty in the performance of service to the community, and toward outsiders was permitted the use of force. Now the principal injunction is of honesty in the observance of contracts amongst business connections, with permission toward others of the use of fraud. But before, in the period of status, duties were imposed upon individuals according to the conditions into which they were born, and there was no escape from them, however arduous they might be. Now, no obligations exist, save those which are voluntarily assumed in contracts. And, naturally, disagreeable ones are avoided. Thus, in the rising period, duties of individuals toward the state, in the following, rights of individuals against the state, in the former, obligation, in the latter, liberty. The former is a morality of situation involving official functions or duties, according to one's position in the community, different, therefore, in the various divisions of the people, but imposed upon all by all. The latter is a morality of sentiment, the same for all, each one doing what is right in his own eyes, and letting others enjoy the same privilege, preventing only interference, avoiding everything unpleasant. The difference goes over into economics and politics. It is a change of point of view from a tribal or national to an individualistic, from an effort to join with others for upbuilding and preserving the state, to an effort, when that purpose is effectuated, to participate with others in enjoying the prosperity attained. In short, from producing to consuming. To return to a more peculiar matter of social morality, in the marriage relations, the change takes the form of strict wedlock, at least among the upper classes, in the rising period, and of laxity of divorce for everyone, in the declining. At first, divorce was a misfortune for the wife, by which her immorality in compromising the family was punished, while adultery on the man's part was penalized criminally. But afterward, the wife having property of her own, divorce is no longer a punishment, but is used as a means to obtain release and marriage with the lover. When the lawmakers perceive this, that they are encouraging immorality, they alter the law and make divorce obtainable on lighter grounds. It is made easier also, for the reason that otherwise fewer persons would enter the conjugal state. There is also a more general change. Because of the need at first of contention, the virtues most dwelt upon when intelligent observation was turned toward them were the masculine virtues of fortitude, temperance, wisdom, and justice. But with the advent of the long peace and the coming into prominence of women taking the place of those stern virtues, another set of mild ones come to the fore, the feminine virtues of patience, purity, faith, and affection. These were first taught among the subjugated and oppressed peoples who stood in the greatest need of them, and they pass from them to the lower classes of the dominant people, and work their way up through them, through a mass of selfishness and viciousness which percolates from above. There is a general softening of morals as well as smoothing of manners, indeed, a feminization of them. Before, there was much suffering and endurance, and everybody, being used to pain in his own person, was indifferent to it in others. Now there is more pleasure, and the sharing the joys of others discloses the advantageousness of sympathy, which, however, cannot develop without bringing with it the drawback of sharing their sorrows. Even vicarious pain becomes unendurable. Yet the painful spectacle of pain in others may be eluded by not looking at it. Still, as it presses upon us, the more effective remedy is also desired of lessening it, and especially the infliction of it is decried. The punishment of criminals is not only made less public and is even hidden away behind closed doors, but it is so much diminished as hardly to serve as a deterrent, and law-breaking becomes the order of the day. By now, the old intuitive morality has given way before a rationalizing science of ethics, which, rejecting the old standbys as too rough, experiments with all sorts of new theories, and even with many which experience has long ago disproved. More attention is paid to the welfare of individuals than to the welfare of the whole society or race, and still less to its perpetuation, especially if each individual believes himself immortal. The heroic period has passed away when the individual would actively sacrifice himself for the good of the state. Now, if the individual will sacrifice himself at all, it is passively for the salvation of his own soul. Hence the less attention paid to the procreation of children. For, being more tender about the treatment of existent beings, the best people feel greater responsibility about bringing new beings into existence. Hence also the greater attention paid to the education of those who are born, to prepare them to make their own way in the world rather than to fit into the race as it was and must be if it is to last. The old strife with hard knocks and bloodshed is thought a thing of the past, and with the abandonment of warfare between the states, it is held that competition between individuals should also cease. Socialistic ideas crop up, for the new point of view in morality sets the immediate welfare of the individual before the permanent welfare of the state. Before, it was required of all to contribute equally hard, according to their ability. Now it is required by all that they should enjoy equally according to their needs. Accompanying this change come new ideas about a general equality of the sexes, for women are equal to men in the point of view now emphasized, the capacity to enjoy and to consume. Now, more or less effort is put forth to bring these ideas into practice. In fact, the distinction between the rich and the poor was the last artificial distinction left in society, and it is now the desire to abolish, and with it the great natural distinction between the sexes. Wherefore, with the breaking down of competition, there is less striving within each state as well as between states, until at last, with the diminution of production, especially accompanied by exhaustion of the sources, a new period of hard times sets in, which generates strife again, but finds the more civilized peoples mostly unfit for it, and most likely to give way before the less civilized. Still, another course is run by morality, in the way it is taught. At first, morality is customary, that is, handed on from generation to generation unquestioned, only a little instruction being needed in addition to natural instinct. Such instruction was given to children by their parents, first by their mothers, and then by their fathers, the mothers instilling the broadest and most fundamental precepts and theories, the fathers supplementing with the applications to practice and practically needed variations. As some individuals advancing in prosperity lead the way in civilization, these take it upon themselves to teach the others, and more or less in their own behoof, tell them what they ought to do. There are two original types of such leaders: the spiritually and corporeally superior men, those who get the leadership through greater psychical power, and those who get it through greater physical force, the former persuading others to do their will, the latter compelling them. Hence, with advance in the ascending period, morality is further inculcated, with directions given to the people by priests and by warriors, in religion and in politics. But when the people catch up with these, acquiring both education and arms, and emancipating themselves from their guardians, then intellect gets wider currency, and philosophers or freethinkers arise, who rearrange moral instruction from the point of view of the individual, for which very reason they can never combine, and, as was desired by Plato, become rulers. The experience of the race is renounced. Children are no longer trained how they should go, but are taught to use their reasoning faculties so that they may learn each for himself how he would go, and consequently many are the aberrations incurred. An age of reason, it should be recognized, is not an age merely of the discovery and acceptance of truth. It is an age also of the invention of and running after innumerable errors. Among the new teachers are economists who inquire what should be done for the improvement of material welfare, and those who, having well stewarded their own talents, here exert a profound influence, though mostly they stand discreetly in the background. Later, however, with the coming on of hard times again, these doctrinaires, who have been unable to ward off the accumulating evils, and perhaps have mistakenly or dishonestly assisted their advent, are discredited. Science and learning recede, and now it may even happen that by men of deep emotional nature, the prophetic type, a new religion is introduced, which turns its back on the world, gives up the task of civilization, and exalts the lower classes. And this, or in its default, the old religion, revived and readjusted, soon degenerating into superstition, provides the basic ideas and customs for the last period at the bottom of the cycle, which shades insensibly into the beginning of a new one. Pardon. 5. The fine arts, literature, and science are very slow of growth during the ascending period, and only break into flower near the approach of the culminating period. That art begins religious and ends profane, and that literary composition starts with poetry and proceeds to prose or trite sayings. Jurisprudence runs a more gradual course through the whole cycle, and it is known to progress from procedure by combat or appeal to the deity to procedure by evidence or appeal to one's fellow men. Its course toward the end is a good sample of all. At first it is hard and fast bound in customs generally under religious sanction, with little authority in any or in any body to alter it. But the expansion of the communities into states makes the old swaddling clothes a tight fit, and then an organ of expression is found. The old customs are abrogated, and now follows, especially toward the end of the ascending and throughout the culminating period, an extensive trial of new opinions and a long-continued stream of legislation. In fact, all advance is made by experimentation and the elimination of the unsatisfactory, men, like nature, needing to use selection among many variations. But many of the changes are not improvements, since they bring with them unforeseen consequences, and the people at last flounder in a mess which they cannot control. An end to the welter is sought, once for all, in a selection and collection of laws that are to be final. In short, in codification. Now, codification is in a way the end of all other lines of advance, for everything is finally, for convenience, reduced to rules, which have been discovered during the period of experimentation, and thereafter it does not seem possible to do better than to imitate the best that has been done before. Art, especially in all its branches, becomes surfeited with what has already been accomplished. The culminating period soon turns itself into an age of collections, in literature of libraries, in painting and sculpture of museums, Mechanical contrivances are developed so that production is superseded by reproduction, and cheap copies are multiplied. Everyone has access to all the masterpieces and is overpowered in their presence. It seems as if all the combinations of perfection were preempted, and as if nobody now could do anything but cull and assemble the former excellences. In language, for instance, all the felicities of expression being already invented, what can the later writers do but reiterate the phrases of the earlier, unless they would concoct poorer ones? Aid is provided in summary books of reference, florilegia, anthologies, dictionaries, and encyclopedias. Originality can still be obtained only by leaving the great themes first treated of and turning to the small ones, and by running into all sorts of extravagances. Love of inanimate nature, or of the lower animate nature, encroaches upon love of the higher animate nature, the human form, and admiration of natural scenery, or contemplation of still life, supersedes admiration of human activity. Literature and art were first made principally for men. They are now made principally for women. They become scrappy, embodied more in magazines than in books, more in household ornaments than in public monuments. Of what tries to be really good, only the old is highly prized. Music, which may be forgotten and repeated infinitum, now takes the first rank, and a mixture of all the arts is supplied in the opera. Eclecticism prevails in everything. Only in architecture, city planning, and gardening is there an ever-increasing rivalry and display, between individuals, between cities, between provinces and nations. Their greatest magnificence and luxuriance comes late, supplanting the earlier fineness and grace. All through this period art is commercialized, and those who have the artistic faculty, instead of consulting their own cultivated sense of beauty, seek to make money by trying to please the multitude of rich and middling rich purchasers, in whom the sense of beauty is deficient. It is an age of copyright and of other guarantees of profit. Deterioration is a necessary consequence, when at last not only the old avenues but the new byways are run through till all that they can until all when at last not only the old avenues but the new byways are run through till all they contain is exhausted, art dies. The end of everything is habit, hardening into a new regime of custom, which may be the beginning of another cycle. The old codes become the new modes. Science becomes recognizable in any high degree only a little before the culmination to which it rapidly contributes. For the first period of custom is one of credulity along fixed lines, and is followed by a period of reason, branching forth in all directions. Well known is an analysis of the course of thought into three epochs: the theological, the metaphysical, and the positivist, or scientific. A fourth is forgotten, the skeptical. The theological and the metaphysical are but two halves of the ascending period. Then comes the scientific, ushering in the culminating period. But before it, the metaphysical epoch was critical of the theological and began the advance. The scientific period is critical of the metaphysical. Then at last criticism turns upon science itself, and the whole crumbles. When no further discoveries can be made, people tire of truths grown old, as they tired of the old errors. They now sink back into new errors like the old. This takes place in the declining period, and in the debris room is made for, for the theological or personal trend of human thought to spring up again. 6. Religion is a conception of the universe that affects emotion and incites action. It is mostly based on a personal metaphysics and tries to base itself on revelation from a supernal person or persons, employing the supernatural, being receptive from it, and consequently convinced that all that is good for us has been revealed. It is the antithesis of science, which employs only the natural, wins its own way, and never has enough. Accordingly, it is at its zenith of influence only when science is at its nadir. Yet it employs also the natural as a window for the supernatural to shine through, and makes use of as much science as its disposal as serves its purpose. It can begin, therefore, at least in its higher forms, only in an old civilization prepared for or already entering upon its decline. And it helps on the decline by substituting satisfied belief and emotion for eager inquiry and the employment of reason. It degenerates into superstition when its leaders become priests who, continuing to possess a modicum of the previous knowledge of nature in the midst of an ignorant populace, impose upon them by showing wondrous prescience and performing marvelous deeds. This is the condition at the beginning of a cycle, except that at the beginning of the primitive cycle, priests or medicine men and meteorologists were perhaps themselves the discoverers of a few natural laws, the secret of which they kept to themselves. These men appear to have control of natural forces by their communication, as they believe, or at all events pretend, with supernatural beings. For ignorance does not distinguish, and extraordinary exhibitions of power it takes for supernatural. Imagination now has full swing, and fear is rampant of the unknown. Hence there is unity of belief, at least in a general scheme, throughout the whole race, although every locality may have its own special god or saint. The priests work miracles, as it seems to the people, and receive pay from the beneficiaries, and they also prescribe to those who consult them that they must take a part, must attend regularly, must do homage, must disclose their doings and desires, all avowedly to the god, through the interposition only of the priests. To save from impending ills is the principal object, from ills in this world first, but also from ills imagined in another. The priesthood lives on fees and on landed property put in its possession, and it lives well. But as the people become enlightened, and find that the services they are paying for are not rendered as unfailingly as they now can get them from others, cures being more frequently effected by physicians, and battles more surely won by machinery, the oracles become dumb, and miracles cease, except in remote regions or secluded spots, among peasants dwelling in villages, or on heaths, pagans or heathen. The priesthood is despoiled of its land, its numbers are reduced, and its support is taken over by the state or by the people, the pay system being introduced also here, and the priest serving those from whom he gets his salary. For this is the period of the supremacy of money, and the owners of wealth, having present enjoyments, are thoughtless of unforeseen ills. And the seekers after it are hard-headed and critical, demanding results and paying close attention to causes and effects. The priest now becomes a mere preacher, providing the instruction and consolation which the rulers desire for the people, or the people desire for one another. His rivals are the philosophers or scientists, who offer instructions and other hopes, and also the politicians, who create other distraction, and especially the actors and singers, who furnish other entertainment. The clergy likewise aim at effect, and look for new objects of interest. the old central authority being removed, and the new one careless. Numerous sects are formed by division from the overgrown body of the old religion. Also, religions of other countries are imported as exciting novelties, and everywhere strange fanes are erected. Even devotion must now cater to the emotions of women. Dissipation occurs of religious as of other forces, but when, in the general disintegration and the approach to misery, all these things must pass off the scene, and the world becomes serious again, and men again take charge of it, then appeal is once more made to powers other than human, and either the old hierarchy or the leading men of the new religion that has won most, following the successful one, following the successful ones among many competitors gradually assume or reassume the functions of the former priests, and religion again rises as science and civilization fall, for which reason religion is the strongest link between cycles, rising in the decline of one and sinking in the rise of another. 7. In the course of politics may be perceived a grand division between the rule of the upper classes and the rule of all the classes. The former exists during the ascending and part of the culminating period, the latter during the rest of the culminating and most of the declining period. The former is itself divisible, according to the class which rules, into the rule of the priests, the rule of the warriors, and the rule of the rich. The priests and the warriors generally begin together, with varying vicissitudes in their rivalry among different peoples, sometimes the priests getting the upper hand and forming what they pretend to be a theocracy, or rule of a god, but generally ending by their being supplanted by the warriors, who form an era of aristocracy. Then the warriors and the priests with them are brought under control by the rich, the merchants, manufacturers, and financiers, who form an era of plutocracy, during which, as is natural, takes place the greatest advance in material prosperity. Throughout this period, the rulers rule by their own might, each by the peculiar power of which they have the monopoly. The priests by learning, the warriors by arms, the rich by money, each of them in turn getting possession of most of the land. The priests, however, assert they rule by divine right, and the warriors, at first asserting that they rule by the right of the sword, might, making right, at least get the priests, when subdued, to admit and to teach that they too rule by divine right. The rich have hardly ventured to put in this claim very seriously. They rule by their own superior shrewdness. They are the capable men, who, having managed their own affairs well, have shown their fitness to manage the affairs of others also. At best, owing their advancement to their native endowments, they claim to rule by natural right, or lawyers, who are the accompanying shadow of this class, try to make out that property is the essential thing in government, since it pays the taxes, and therefore claim that as those who own most contribute most, and have the most at stake, it is logically right that they should have the most to say about the disposal. All these classes pay themselves for the work they do in ruling the rest, and like all monopolists, they pay themselves well. At first, each ruling class recognizes some duty it has to perform toward the ruled, of guiding and protecting them, and furthering their interests. For at the beginning, in each class, there were competitors, and only those succeeded in getting the upper hand who won the people to their side by their promise and performance of favoring them and of viewing their own rule as a trust. Each class must, of course, rule itself as well as the rest, and it does so generally at first by selection of its leaders, and finally by hereditary succession, at first trusting only the execution to them, and at last the decision at first in a republican form, and finally in a monarchical, though each class has its own way, the warriors coming to monarchy quickest and with the wealthy slowest. Also, each class in turn becomes degenerate, as its power passes into the hands of descendants who owe their elevation only to their birth, look more and more to mere enjoyment, and taking more pay, do less work, until at last they are superseded by the original superior men of the next class. Thus each class rule, forming a small cycle by itself with its own waxing and waning. But when each of the succeeding classes come into power, it pulls down its predecessor only from its preeminence and position of privilege, and continues to use it as a support, so that the priests remain in high office under the warriors, and the priests and warriors under the rich, but each in a changed form. The priests, as we have seen, as preachers, and the warriors as paid officers of the army. And as each remembers its quantum domination and continues to have its own interests, it forms a party in the political life of the state. Through all these changes, there is constant growth of the power of the central government and of its action upon the people. Ever more and more does it regulate the doings of society, substituting laws for customs. At last, the lower classes, winning education, arms, and a certain amount of wealth, for their inferior possession of all which they make up by their larger numbers, come into power, overthrowing the others from their predominance, but as each class did before, leaving them as parties, and only placing themselves at their side as participants in the government. This introduces the last half of the great division of the course of politics. We have now reached the culminating period of civilization, with its manifoldness and complexity of occupations and interests. Enjoyment dissipates. Before, when there was little variety of recreation, the people took their amusement by meeting together and talking over their common affairs. Then concert was possible, and conspiracies of almost a whole class could be hatched, and revolutions could be planned and successfully executed. But later, everyone becomes engaged in seeking after his own pleasure, and finds it at most in small cliques of boon companions, for the meeting of even a whole town in a theatre is merely to receive similar impressions, without any common action on their own part. Concert and united action, thereupon, become much less usual. The ascending period of civilization is always marked by revolutions. The declining period is a long quiescence, disturbed only by occasional futile uprisings or riots that do more harm than good. This last half of the great division of politics is further distinguished from the first half by the fact that now all classes rule all. The power of government reaches its maximum, and it is prepared to regulate everything. Affairs of state, needing special officials, these are now chosen directly or indirectly by the people as their representatives and agents, or if any one of the old rulers is left, he is reduced to being regarded and treated and made to behave as such. These agents are paid by the people with salaries, which are not so large as the emoluments the former rulers took to themselves, and their offices are now a public trust, not because they are so solicitous so to view them, but because the people require it of them, and they do not rule in their own right, or by divine, or by natural right, but in the right of the ruling and ruled, the self-ruled people, or by a convention right given to them by all the classes. This condition has generally been called democracy, but mistakenly, since it is not the rule of the demos, or lowest class, but the rule of all the classes, and would be better called pantocracy. In such democracy itself, for the term is too habitual to be discarded, The most powerful of the old classes is that of the rich, upon which the others lean, and this class of the rich, or the three first classes in one, under this name, though they prefer to look upon themselves as aristocrats, may even regain influence and power so great as to overbalance the rest, forming a state which is describable by the somewhat incongruous term of plutocratic democracy. Over against this condition, the demos proper may wish to get the upper hand entirely and entirely suppress the other classes. This movement is today known as socialism, though this term is more appropriately to our present condition, though this term is more truly appropriate to our present condition, and what is so distinguished is democracy proper in the literal sense. And sometimes, for greater clarity, it is dubbed social democracy, which, in the full extent of its aspiration, has never existed, and, as we shall see further on, probably never will exist, at least not in our cycle of civilization. The democracy such as has existed and as now exists, or pantocracy, which rules by agents and makes laws by representatives of the whole people, always sets out with a multiplicity of representatives to whom the appointment or the oversight of innumerable other agents is entrusted, in the form known as republicanism. But as responsibility divided between many is diluted and tends to be little observed, the degeneration of republicanism works for the concentrations of power in one representative, to whom is entrusted the direction of all the others. Under this one all-powerful individual, all the classes are reduced to an equal position of inferiority, and other individuals can rise to power only as they win his favor, or that of his favorites. This last stage can be reached only when the people at large are so unwarlike, and so distracted and divided by their several occupations and amusements, that a comparatively small army in the one man's pay can keep them all in subjection. And when once reached, it can, in spite of its enormous and growing evils, never be subverted from within the nation by the people, for the additional very good reason that the people have nothing to substitute for it. Previous degenerate rulers, as we have seen, because they were of a class, could be overthrown and replaced by the better rule of a newly uprisen class in a line of progress. But in a succession of single rulers representing a degenerate people, although any and every one of them, on becoming degenerate, may be pulled down by the people, or by the court, or by the army, he can be replaced only by another single ruler of the same sort, better perhaps at first, but with the same proneness to quick deterioration, or the only rivaling powers that of the rising priesthood, who also tends to come under the dominion of one of their own number, and either share in or get possession of the political power, and in either case augment rather than mitigate the evils that come from the rule of some men over others who are not strong enough to hold them to a strict accounting. Such is the despotism, Caesarism, or imperialism, ultimately more or less mixed with hierarchism, in which all republicanism and all civilization hitherto has ended. Thank you for joining me today. Again, I'm very sorry for the noise in the background, the dog barking and the door opening, but that's just something I have to deal with right now. So again, thank you and have a blessed day.